I've touched on today's topic before, but never quite in so much depth as I'm going to do today. This one also is more personal, at least more personal for Matthew. It's not so much geared to proving things for skeptics. It's not concerned with the major plagiarists, the major literary figures that plagiarized Mathew Franklin Whittier and his wife, Abby Poyen Whittier. This has to do with Matthew writing ostensibly on a entertaining level, humorously, but really writing about deeply personal things in his own life. So he did this many times, but I guess if anything, in terms of evidence, I want to show that he did that and demonstrate how he did it. But this, mainly, I just want to share this. And I know that we have some skeptics who are not necessarily respectful, some of them, but we have some who are. And this is also for the future, I think, when people will be more receptive to everything that I'm presenting here and will be really interested in not only in me, but in Mathew and Abby. So what I'm talking about is a poem, and I have to give the background for this. In 1851 and 1852, Mathew was writing for the Boston Carpetbag. He actually was a behind-the-scenes originator of this paper and sunk quite a bit of his own money into it, as I gather. And he wasn't officially listed as an associate editor, but he was close personal friends with the editor, Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber. He kind of negotiated his way with the other people involved with it, some of whom were of other political persuasions. It was a very difficult situation in terms of internal politics. Shillaber himself, I think, was kind of a mild conservative. Mathew was a flaming liberal, radical, really speaking. There were other conservatives on there. The other people were competent writers, but Mathew was a literary genius. And I'm saying that matter-of-factly. He was better than any of the other ones, I think, except possibly John Townsend Trowbridge, who made an occasional appearance in here as Paul Creighton. He was also a literary genius. The others were good writers, but some of them, a lot of them actually imitated Mathew. So there was a whole issue with imitation. There was also an issue with Mathew being so radical that he was angering people who were probably making death threats against him. And this had to do with at least a couple areas that he wrote about. One of them was slavery, and he was an abolitionist. He was also affiliated with William Lloyd Garrison, who was a disunionist, so there was another level to that, because Garrison and his followers really wanted the South, if they weren't going to shape up and start behaving morally, he wanted them to leave. See? But he was also, having been raised a Quaker, he was anti-military, and in particular, anti-imperialism. He didn't mind, matter of fact, he applauded it if real military heroes were acting nobly for a noble cause. He didn't have a problem with that. What he had a problem with was people who really deep down just had an infatuation with the glory of war and pretended that it was patriotic and pretended that it came from noble motives, see? He had no mercy for such people because they caused such havoc and such suffering in the world. He had been a strong critic of the Mexican-American War a few years back, for example, which he saw as strictly imperialism, just a land grab, which it was. So he wrote a couple characters, but one of them was Ensign Jehiel Stebbings, who was a phony war hero, basically, a jingoistic war hero. And Mathew painted him, because he was in this dicey territory with a bunch of conservatives, he painted him very carefully. You'd swear that he was serious, but if you looked a little deeper into it, you'd find that he was making fun of him and his ilk, see? Like, for example, he'd write this poem, supposedly written by Ensign Stebbings, which sounded like a wonderful, stirring, patriotic poem. And then you'd see that he was all bullshitting because he talked about how he'd survived the Alamo, you know. So Mathew had a lot of fun with that character, but apparently there were people who did not think it was funny and threatened him, see. And he also had his second family from his estranged wife in Portland, and he was very concerned about them being vulnerable. So he was very careful, but apparently he got identified. And I think this happened because probably Schilleber was doing this. He was doing a biographical sketch of the different contributors, and he would present the character, not the actual writer, but the character, and do a little write-up on that character as though it was a real person. Well, one of Matthew's many characters was Ferdinand Mendes Pinto, who was a historical Portuguese explorer who bullshitted like crazy about his exploits. See? So Matthew would take that name and write these outrageous bullshit stories, all directed at one of his imitators, who was named John C. Moore and wrote a character named Peter Snooks. Well, John C. Moore was a pretty competent writer, but he didn't have an original bone in his body, and he imitated Matthew mercilessly. So Matthew took after him with this character Pinto. Well, they ran a little workup of Pinto and had an image of him. You can't see his face because he's hidden behind an umbrella. I'll put it up here on the screen. But you can see that he's tall and lanky, and Matthew was 6'2". See, so I think somebody put two and two together and said, I'll bet that's Mathew Franklin Whittier that's writing Pinto. And they kind of worked that backwards and maybe figured out that he was Stebbings as well. Now, in Schilleber's memoirs, many years later, he says that Benjamin Drew was writing the entire series, Trismegistus, that these different characters came out of, including Stebbings. But Matthew had used Trismegistus years and years ago, like in 1828. That was his pseudonym. This was his series, and somebody figured it out. So he'd had death threats. There's another clue that he was out in the country to avoid these death threats. But in fact, as in my notes, in the Daily Atlas in Portland of April 5, 1852, there is a little news article that says that Matthew's flat, connected with the Sawyer Grocery on Pearl and Congress Streets in Portland, was burned out. I think that happened when he was out in the country. He had death threats. They couldn't find him, so they burned his flat along with a grocery that was probably sitting above. So he really did have a dangerous situation. And what I want to show now is that Abby in the spirit world warned him about this. Now, Matthew had been writing poems, all more or less under the title Over the Way, meaning in the astral realm in heaven. He'd been writing poems to the spirits over the way. He was a spiritualist during this time. And I think that Schilleber kind of made fun of it. And at least one of the other writers wrote a parody on it. Matthew was presented as the sensitive man, kind of mocking him because he was very sensitive. And these poems, which Matthew wrote under this title Over the Way, first to the astral realm and its inhabitants, and then to Abby there specifically, show that he was in contact with her, that he was trying to be in contact with her. So we have that little piece of the puzzle. Now, we get into, with that as the background, the February 7, 1852 edition of the Boston Carpetbag. And here I have volume 1 of the Carpetbag. It's extremely rare. I was fortunate to get it for, I think it was $350 or $375. They had it on eBay, buy it now for this price, and I just snapped it up. It's probably, well, one that was autographed by one of the contributors went for over $800 in an auction a while back. That was the second volume. So I feel bad in a way of taking advantage of this person who didn't know what they had, but I need to bring it home, and I don't have $800. So if I had all the money in the world, I would have just offered this guy more, said, look, this is worth more, I'm taking advantage of you. But I couldn't. So here we have the first poem. This is a spin-off from Trismegistus, or Trismegistus, however it's pronounced. The dictionary says Trismegistus. I always wanted to say Trismegistus, and then I found somebody else that says Trismegistus after I'd already trained myself to say Trismegistus because I didn't want to look stupid. So I don't know which it is. Anyway, this is the first of a series, and the background of this is they had panoramas that were like movies, except instead of a projected moving image, they had a huge mural on a scroll, apparently, that would be scrolled across the stage. And all the people would sit in the theater, just like a movie theater, and they'd watch this mural scroll across. Well, this happened to be a panorama of the Crystal Palace, which was to say the World's Fair in London, which Matthew had attended the previous year when he'd written as Quails, which was not Ashendaj. He had attended it, but apparently he'd missed seeing this particular statue. And he's writing in verse as a reporter. Again, it's a spinoff. He was actually working as a reporter during this period. But here, and I think this would have been when it first opened in December of the previous year, even though it's being published in February. The byline is by our city reporter, and I'm going to go ahead and read this down from the beginning down to the point that's relevant for us, because he goes on and talks a little bit about the Crystal Palace, which is what this series is supposed to be about, but he gets kind of sidetracked here. Now remember that his late wife, Abby Poyen Whittier, had died in March of 1841, and he's still grieving for her. And we're going to have the proof of that here if anybody needs proof for that. Dear Carpetbag, I went last night when the snow was hard and the stars were bright to see the mirror at Amory Hall of the Crystal Palace World's Fair and all the gems of industry, wealth, and art within that most unmartial mart. He saw it as an answer to military exploitation and aggression. And as your servant, bound in duty to post you up in the sights of town, I pluck a quill from the wing of beauty and jot my meditations down. Now, what you see is that Matthew is an excellent poet, and yet he writes humorously. So there's this very strange mix of humor and serious poetry because, you see, his older brother was a famous poet, and he was very shy about putting himself forth as a poet in competition with John Greenleaf Whittier. So he would very much downplay his own abilities as a poet. But this mix of humor where he's kind of making light of himself that way and seriousness is what you see in The Raven, and it's what the editor of American Review commented on. That struck him. So he commented on that in the introduction to The Raven, that it's an odd mix of humor and serious. So you'll see that very strongly in this little poem. The hall was warm, and every seat, quote, as full as an egg is full of meat. I saw there many a Boston belle, and eke her beau to guard and court her, and countless were the smiles that fell to cheer the heart of your own reporter. The eyes were bright, and ditto gas, and when the curtains, swift upbounding, displayed the glorious house of glass, and all the fairy scene surrounding, a lovely vision it did seem, that bore me back to dear old London, see, he had been there, until the plaudits broke my dream, and I awoke to matters mundane. I saw the dove-eyed Grace's home, the vast aerial glittering palace, as bright and fragile as the foam that gleams on hope's enchanted chalice. Westminster Abbey's hoary pile, where sleep the poets, kings, and sages, who swayed of old the ocean isle and live in history's brightest pages. The royal parks, the royal home, the courts of law, the giant dome of old St. Paul's, and all the rest of London glorious in the west. The East, you know, is not the thing for such a muse as mine to sing. But how shall I with printer's ink essay to paint the royal scene? I want all colors, blue and pink, red, yellow, everything but green. For 'tis in truth a noble sight, if gold and silks and jewels bright, if glittering dress and waving plumes, and shawls from India's costliest looms, if sculptured forms and fountains fair that scatter coolness through the air, if palms from India's tropic sky, and blazoned banners hung on high, if carpets where we tread on flowers that mock the withering power of time, and bloom as fair in polar bowers as in their own luxuriant clime, if all that fills the gazer's eye with wonder and with ecstasy can make a royal scene, 'tis clear we have a royal opening here. Then the tenor of the poem changes. But turning from the pomp of power, which well may claim a brighter hour, my muse, being out of sorts today, will better sing a pensive lay to cheer the lovelorn maiden's bower, And in your next I'll try a stave about the transept and the nave, and then run on through each division, divisions where no discord reigned, and wind up all the exhibition with what our gallant clipper gained, because there was a race that America won. In one side scene, withdrawn from sight, the Nymph of Lyrleyburg is sitting. I think you'll find her on the right. She holds a lute, and not her knitting. And in her wild, dejected air, I seem to read a fixed despair that blinded me to all the glare of pomp and pride that glistened there. Some memory of the past came o'er me, and days long vanished rose before me. I thought, no matter what I thought, such dreams as mine are lightly wrought, and lightly made, as lightly shivered. And now it seemed as if in truth a beam of light that gleamed and quivered upon the silvery tide of youth came back to cheer, and not in vain, a spirit dulled with voiceless pain. And as I pressed my couch at night, her image hovering round me seemed, and at the first of morning light I jotted down the things I dreamed, and once again to slumber sunk, with chattering teeth, your friend, A. Trunk. Well, he signed A. Trunk, and I think that has to do with the what then later became the Grand Trunk Railroad in Portland. It's a reference to him having a base in Portland. But clearly, when he saw the Nymph of Lyrleyburg, it reminded him of Abby, and specifically of Abby toward the end of her life when they had lost their 8-month-old daughter, Sarah, possibly in a fire. But anyway, they'd lost their daughter, Sarah, and she was inconsolable. And the Nymph of Lyrleyburg, I looked this statue up, and it does look quite a bit like Abby. I won't show the comparison because I have the feeling that Abby doesn't want me to. You know, she's a little shy of the people that are watching, some of them. But I will show you the Nymph of Lyrleyburg, and you'll have to take my word for it that she looks quite a bit like Abby and could very well have reminded Matthew. Now, the other thing is that Matthew would often fondly refer to Abby as a nymph or a water sprite. And I have a number of references to that, which I've shared in previous video blogs. So I won't go into that, but there's a story there, which means that this was a sign. And Abby made sure that there were several elements to this sign that would identify it as her. Okay. So she gave Matthew the sign of the nymph, you know, that looked like her. And then she gave him spirit contact, which at first he was afraid of or thought was just his imagination. And then he realized, my gosh, this is real. And then at night, he had a visitation dream. Well, he's talked about visitation dreams from Abby before and afterwards. This isn't the first time we have the Over the Way series, for example. And there's a number of poems about the visitation dreams that he got from Abby. So here's another one. He's saying that he had a spirit contact with her in the middle of that sign, and then he had a visitation dream with her that night. But what was the dream? Well, it so happens that in a different publication, he told us what the dream was, which I think is fascinating myself. And that is in, first off, I've got to show you the Nymph of Lyrleyburg and talk a little bit about that. There is an image of it in the Illustrated London News, and it is in the August 23, 1851 edition, where they have a large section dedicated to the Crystal Palace, and they show all the stuff that's in the Crystal Palace, including statues, and they show the Nymph of Lyrleyburg, which I will put up on the screen. I won't open it up here because I'm trying to be kind of careful with those spines. But now we've got a piece in the Boston Weekly Museum. Matthew was a very heavy contributor to the Boston Weekly Museum. He had returned from his trip in Europe as of October 1851, so he was back in the States, but he was traveling apparently, and he also was doing some freelance reporting during this time. However, he wrote and probably mailed in this scene in a Western editor's sanctum. It's not really a Western editor, but because there's kind of roughness and violence involved, he set it in the West, I think. And I'm going to show the accompanying illustration on the screen here. And I'm going to read it for you. The gist of it is that we have a superficial plot and a serious plot underneath, because he's going to tell us what that visitation dream was. And he's going to tell us how he tried to interpret it and how two different sides of his personality fought. The skeptic and the believer, just like you see in the Raven, fought with each other in terms of how to interpret this dream. So I'm going to read it straight through. It's not terribly long. Seen in a Western editor's sanctum, reported and illustrated for the Boston Weekly Museum. This is unsigned. I am 100% sure this is Mathew Franklin Whittier. You either believe me or not, but after studying 2,300 of his works over 11 years and having the emotional and, memory from that past life, I'm telling you this is definitely Mathew. And then we have in brackets at the top, by way of introduction, editor seated at a table, surrounded with exchange papers and manuscripts. Enter a poet, capital P, accompanied by a fighting man who is armed with a large cane and whose breast pockets are heavily loaded. Now remember, this is the war between Matthew's skeptical side and his belief, his emotions, and his belief in Abby and the other side. The editor is the skeptical, the skeptical one. The poet is the emotional one. And the fighting man is Matthew's efforts to overwhelm his skeptical side with his beliefs. So he's taken his own psychology and split it into three figures. Poet: good morning, sir. You received a poem last week entitled A Hope Dream by John Parnassus Clymer. Did you not? Editor: I did, sir. Poet: you say in your notices to correspondence this week, if I mistake not, that the poem is inadmissible. Am I correct? Editor: you are. Editor: well, sir, I have called. Oh, that's a mistake here. This should be the poet. Poet: well, sir, I have called with an intimate friend to learn your reasons for refusing to publish my song and to ask if you mean to persist in your refusal. Editor: my reasons are simply that the production is not fit for publication. Poet: why unfit? Fighting man, balancing his cane: yes, why unfit? Editor, testily: it is, if I must be plain with you, faulty in every respect, and it no more deserves the name of poetry than fish scales deserve that of coin. I can coin no better comparison at present. Poet: I do not agree with you. It is the best poem I ever wrote, and the ram's horn of liberty and annihilator of oppression, printed at Jericho, has published several of my pieces. Editor: perhaps you had better offer the poem in question to that redoubtable paper. Poet: I do not choose to do that, sir, and I am determined to get into the metropolitan prints. Are you willing to do me justice? Fighting man: yes, are you willing to do him justice? Editor: really, gentlemen, this is an absurd proceeding on your parts. Poet: what, sir? Do you still refuse to publish? Fighting man: stand back, Parnassus Clymer, and let me deal with him. Will you listen to me, sir? Editor: I will, sir, if you will be brief. I have a large amount of copy to furnish my printers this afternoon. Fighting man: I will be brief. This poet is my friend, and I'm bound to see justice done on him. Now, sir, you may pledge your word to publish his pieces, or... Editor: I cannot do. Fighting man, fiercely: what, sir? You shall do it, or... raises his cane menacingly. Editor, trembling: or at least, if I must print it, I must have the privilege of correcting. Poet, hastily: oh yes, that's what I want you to do. Editor: perhaps I can print it on that condition. I think I will, on reflection. Fighting man, cane still flourished: is this affair all settled then? Editor: yes. Poet: yes. Fighting man: you acknowledge that my friend, Mr. Parnassus Clymer, is a poet? Editor: oh, yes, sir. Fighting man: that he has the, Poet: divine afflatus. Fighting man: the divine flaters? Editor: oh, certainly, any quantity. Fighting man lowers his cane and goes out, with poet leaning on his arm. The following is the copy of A Hope Dream as originally written. Now, this is the poet's original poem, meaning that this was Matthew's first interpretation of the dream that he had, his emotional, intuitive interpretation. I dreamed that, and of course he's going to put this in horrible poetry because he's in character. I dreamed that I was on the water and that I met an old man's daughter. We glided o'er the stream together, and she and I the storms did weather. And though this girl on the water I met, we arrived in safety without getting wet. And she told me sweetly that hope had taught her how to pass in safety over the water. And when I woke from the dream of the water, over which I glided with the old man's daughter, I felt that the true meaning of the vision was that I should soon be released from prison. Now, this is humorous, but what Matthew means is that he interpreted it to mean that he's going to die soon. He's had death threats, so he interpreted it to mean he's going to die soon and rejoin Abby, and that it will be tantamount to being released from prison. Now we have a dream as revised by the editor. This is what his skeptical side came out with after he had thought about it and wrestled with it. See? I met a maiden in my dream while sailing o'er a ruffled stream. Together we in safety crossed, when each alone would have been lost. Before we met, each had been driven by adverse winds and vainly striven to cross the turbulent changing stream in safety over. Such my dream. If you would cross in safety over the stream of life, seek out a lover, for singly none the storms may weather, while two in safety cross together. Now, the editor has completely changed the meaning of the poem, although it's better written, technically. Matthew's editor has changed Abby's visitation dream, in which she was telling him she was going to protect him in the coming storm, which did in fact come. He's changed it to his conviction that he should find another partner, that he should remarry, see? Totally changed the meaning of it. So he has one side that wants to be faithful to Abby in the astral world and writes poems to over the way. And he has another side that wants to get a new partner, see? And that side rationalizes that the dream was for that purpose and not for the purpose of Abby actively still in his life, protecting him and warning him. So, and nobody ever caught this. First off, it was unsigned. And secondly, nobody would ever have realized what the real message of this poem was, what it was really talking about. It took me a little while. You know, I read it and I thought, there's something more to this. And then it kind of dawned on me slowly. I don't know why that happens. I don't know why I had like a sudden epiphany. Maybe if I was under hypnosis, I would immediately know what it was. But in normal waking consciousness, that has not been my experience. My experience has been that I'm fooled right along with the rest of the readers in the 19th century. And then it kind of sheepishly dawns on me, wait a minute. And then a little later, I thought, this has got to be the dream that he talked about when he wrote the poem as A Trunk. That was the dream he had when he pressed his head on his couch that night, see? So you put all of this together and you get the picture that he was writing this anti-military, anti-imperialistic, very edgy material for the otherwise conservative carpetbag. And they published a picture of Pinto, and they figured out who Pinto was, that was Mathew Franklin Whittier, and they started sending him death threats or threats against his family, but I think death threats. And he skipped town and wrote from out of town. And when he had gone to Amory Hall, he had this warning from Abby and this assurance that she would look after him, and this spirit contact, and a sign, which was to say the statue that looked like her, that was a nymph, a river sprite, because the Nymph of Lyrleyburg is a mythical German river sprite. So, and then he writes about the dream and about his difficulty in reconciling his intuitive reaction to the dream with his skeptical mind, which wants to interpret it as a sign that he should, find another partner or something. So it's all there, and there's much, much more. I could take that and, make connections from there and make connections back the other way and talk about the relationship with B.P. Shilleber and Matthew's involvement in that paper and the Over the Way poems and the whole thing. I could go on and on. I could talk about Matthew's other poems where he talked about visitation dreams from Abby. I could talk about the visitation dream I had with her in this life when I first got back together with her, and a whole bunch of other things. I could take it 100 different directions because it's all a tapestry and all the threads are connected. But I think we'll leave it here for now. I like to keep it around half an hour. We're at about half an hour, and I've got a little editing to do. So I hope somebody either now or possibly in the future found this interesting. The previous entry is extremely strong evidence that Matthew wrote a precursor to A Christmas Carol before he and Abby wrote the original. It's very much on point. I strongly urge anybody who watches this to go back and watch that in its entirety. I did it yesterday. I think we have 4 viewers so far. And some of the ones before that, we have 19, but that is every bit as strong in terms of evidence as anything else that I've got that Matthew was the author of The Christmas Carol, because this story is so on point. I mean, whenever you say something like that, people think you're exaggerating. They think you're embellishing because everybody in the world now embellishes. I don't. I only talk in enthusiastic language about something if the thing I'm talking about merits it. And this is a flat out proof that Matthew was a co-author of A Christmas Carol because it is so absolutely on target in terms of the similarities. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, So check that out, and we will see what comes next.